Hey, welcome back to Tuesday. This is part one of our video lecture for Tuesday over the civil rights. Remember, tomorrow on Wednesday you have your vocab quiz over part one of your terms, so make sure you're finishing up those 11 terms, studying them so you're ready to go for the quiz tomorrow. Okay? Today in our video lecture series, it's going to be a little bit less review. We're going to get into some actual key influential people and figures and some major events that maybe you don't know of that go along with the civil rights movement. The first one, yes, will be review, but it's very instrumental for setting up the next parts. Okay, it's supposed to be beautiful today, great weather, sunshine. Make sure you get outside at some point today. Exercise, go hang out, with your dog or something outside. But enjoy the weather. Make sure you get outside and soak up the sun. All right, it's supposed to be warm too, so you can't beat that. I'm already getting my tan going. So, all right. So starting off, Brown versus Board of Education is our second major Supreme Court case. If you remember back to yesterday, and if you don't, guess what? You can just click on my video lecture from yesterday. We talked about the first important Supreme Court case, which was Plessy versus Ferguson. You're right. So Brown versus Board of Education is the second. And this ruling is instrumental because what's it going to do? It's going to integrate schools, all right? So Brown versus Board of Education was all for the desegregation of public schools, all right? That's important to know public, all right? Private schools can do what they want. Public schools have to fall under federal law, all right? Hence why this is going to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States. It was a set of cases from Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C., it was presided over by that guy that we finished up talking about on Monday, Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP. Marshall's the one that argued the case, and he had that really good cross testimony of the Dahl test. All right, if you think back to the last unit, we talked about the Dahl test. The Dahl test is where 16 African American children had to look at a white and black doll. They had to choose which one was good and which one was bad. Most of them chose the white doll as the good doll and the black doll as the bad doll. Why? Because that's how society had placed this stigma on skin color. At a young age, children looked at skin color and said, this skin color is good, this skin color is bad. They knew nothing about the person. They never interacted with the person. But because of the way society values and treats people, this is how people think. Even African American children look at their own skin color and say, well, this is bad because this is what society is telling me is bad. And so that's what he's trying, the point that he's trying to make in the case is we have to break this stigma. So people at a young age aren't being brainwashed with these ideas, and as they get older, this is their only way of thinking. We have to change it so that they're accepting and they can judge people based on their characteristics, their traits, and their beliefs. The court case lasted a year and a half. And on May 17th, 1954, they ruled separate but equal was not good enough. All right, separating the schools, separating the facilities, that's not good. We have to integrate. All right, because what's happening with this separation is we're creating two different societies, and if we continue to create two different societies, it could lead to another civil war in the United States, and it's going to create a lot of social stigma. So we need to get rid of this, all right? And this was a huge decision by the Supreme Court case. Earl Warren was the Chief Justice, and he was all for the civil rights movement. When I say Chief Justice, that means he is the one that is in charge, or the Supreme Justice of the Supreme Court. So you have the 9 justices that make up the Supreme Court. He is the chief. So he is the highest ranking official. And what's good for the civil rights movement during this time, Earl Warren, or the Warren courts, the Supreme Court is always going to rule in favor of civil rights and civil rights litigation. All right? So let's look real quick at some images. You have the New York Times here that says the High Court banned school segregation 9-0. Decision grants time to comply. So obviously, it was an overwhelming consensus on the Supreme Court that segregation is bad, especially in schools. Here's the problem. The end of this headline says time to comply. Well, if you don't say, well, you have to get it done in a year, 2 years, 3 years, what are southern states going to do? They're going to drag their feet, right? Well, we're going to integrate our busing first. We're going to integrate our lunchrooms, not the classrooms. They're always going to keep the classrooms last. And we're going to see this drag into the 60s, 70s, heck, even into the 80s and 90s in some areas where they're pushing away integration because the Supreme Court didn't set a firm deadline. The reason they didn't set a firm deadline is they're afraid with a firm deadline, there's going to be pushback, and this could be physical, so like state militias, an increase in the Ku Klux Klan activity in these areas. So they're trying to soften the blow by saying, okay, we understand this is going to be a big change for you and your society, but you need to change, but we're not telling you how quickly you have to change. So you need to get out that old Confederate ideology and get in this new ideology. The only problem is the new ideology is believing in a lot of that old ideology, all right? And so, again, this is going to take time to actually go into effect. Next one, school desegregation in the South, 1954 to 1976. You see the percentages of public schools in this graph that are desegregating. Look at 1976, you have less than 40%. That means that less than half of public schools are desegregating. Well, I thought the Supreme Court said they had to. Well, who has to enforce it? Federal law, right? State law. Well, are the sheriffs and town police in these small areas in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia going to go in and kick out the help integrate the African American students? No, because their belief is that they should be segregated. It's not until the federal government gets involved and they start sending in the National Guards or the United States military to help with the integration process. And we're going to see that in a few examples, the Little Rock Nine and James Meredith. The next image you see here is an image from a northern school. You can see this is a school that is integrated. You have African Americans and whites sitting together in the same row. You don't have just African Americans sitting in the back of the classroom and whites sitting in the front, so it's not segregated by space. It is completely integrated, all right? And this is the goal for every classroom in the United States. Protesting unfair bus laws. This is probably someone that you've heard of, a very key figure for the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks. Public buses in Montgomery, Alabama were segregated, just like pretty much every other public facility. African Americans had to sit at the back of the bus. So they're allowed to ride the bus, but they only have a certain number of seats in a certain section in which they can ride. If more white riders start to get on the bus, then they have to give up their seats. They have to get off, even if it's not their stop, to accommodate the white riders. All right? So if there's not as many white riders, there can be more African Americans on the bus. The more white riders that get on, the less African Americans you can have. This required African Americans to give up seats to white riders, and they can never share rows. So you couldn't sit side by side with someone. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. She got done working. She gets on the bus. She is tired. She doesn't want to give up her seat. She doesn't understand why she has to give up her seat, because if she gives up her seat, then there's only one person in that row. There's still an empty seat there for her to sit in, but because they cannot share a row with the white rider, she then has to leave the bus and walk the rest of the way home, or wait for another bus, which who knows how long that could be. And so she simply says no, she's not going to get up. The bus driver stops the bus, calls the local law enforcement. The law enforcement say, hey, you've broken the law. This is a segregation law that we have in place, all right? She was arrested, and then a one-day bus boycott on December 5th is done in response to this incident. And that's huge, this one-day bus boycott, because you have to hurt industry in an area that's going to really affect them. That's financially. And a lot of the riders were African Americans that rode buses because they couldn't afford their own cars, so they had to use public transportation. So when African Americans start protesting the buses and stop riding on the buses, well, that's going to be very detrimental to the success of those bus companies. And so this one-day bus boycott is going to raise awareness, and it's going to start to break the bus companies and saying, hey, you need to help us and side with us because we're a majority of your customers. All right. The next slide, you see an image here of Rosa Parks being booked in central booking there in Montgomery, Alabama, getting her fingerprints done. And then you see a picture of a segregated bus. You know, you look at the bus and you can kind of see the mood on the bus when you're looking at the image. And everyone's kind of, you know, like very stoic. You see the African Americans sitting in the back. You see the white riders. You see the one female rider there in the front, the white lady. She got the big sunglasses on. Looks like she doesn't want to be photographed. And then you kind of look to the left a little bit, And you see this guy, and he's like, has this huge smile on his face. And it's almost like he's oblivious to what's happening. Like, here's this oppressive time for one group of people. Everyone's kind of separated, kind of melancholy. No one's really excited. But this one guy is like smiling, like waving the camera. He's like, hey, I'll get my picture taken. We remember forever. So it's just kind of weird, some people's perspectives on what was going on. So, a young minister becomes a leader. You guys can probably imagine who I'm talking about. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led the Montgomery bus boycott. He wants to make it work citizens to organize an elaborate carpool system to get around town, and that is how they're going to defeat the bus system. Many walked, rode bicycles, took taxis, or hitchhiked. And some business owners fired their African-American employees and protesters because they see how it is hurting their business. But the bus is not running, they're not getting customers. So they're blaming them for the downfall in their company, which isn't right by any means, but it's a way to take out their frustration. But if one African-American decides to say, you know what, it's not worth it, I need my job, I'm going to quit the protest, then they're going to lose that unity in this. And they have to stay unified in this effort against these groups of people that are trying to oppress them. They attack protesters and even set off bombs. They firebombed several churches because this is one area where the African Americans would congregate to talk about their protests, to organize, to set up the carpooling, because it was a very focal part of their community, was church. Especially in the South, most people on Sundays go to church. And so this is a common meeting place. It's a common place where people get together, express ideas, and share beliefs. When the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was being influential, he is obviously very connected to the church in the South. Martin Luther King Jr. earned a national reputation as a civil rights leader with the Montgomery bus boycott and how effective he was using civil disobedience, right? And using that nonviolent method. And people are going to be attracted to that. And people are going to say, hey, this works, all right? So maybe it's something that we need to think about instituting as well. The next slide, you see a picture in the middle is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One of very few white-collar African Americans in the South. He had an education, obviously has his doctorate, very well spoken, so he can go in front of state legislatures. He can go in front of Congress and speak, and he is above and beyond intellectual. And so no one can talk down to him. No one can try and outsmart Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He is able to use his background in education, his background as a preacher, and he is able to unify the people in an educated manner, which is very beneficial. African Americans churches support the movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. helped establish the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is the SCLC, in 1957. They pledged to use nonviolent resistance for a means of change. Again, so you can see who clearly is the victim, and that's going to be the minorities and the African Americans. He vowed that they would not resort to violence to achieve their ends, peaceful and steadfast in their pursuit of justice, and that is a very powerful tactic. When you see pictures in the newspaper of African Americans being beat by the police officers, attacked by dogs, water hoses used on them, fire bombings, it's going to be very clear who the victim is in every situation and who the aggressor is. And so when people in the North start seeing this, and people throughout the United States start seeing it and saying, why are these Southern people acting this way? Why are white Southerners feeling the need to attack, persecute, and harm African Americans? It's really going to help the civil rights movement and what they're trying to accomplish. All right, that is all of part 1 for Tuesday. We are getting ready to get into part 2 of our video lecture here in a second. So I will see you guys here in about 2-3 seconds. All right, grab something to drink, grab something to eat, and we'll get right back at it. See ya.